James M. Dawley, MD, is a practicing emergency physician and the founder of the White Coat Investor. After multiple run ins with unscrupulous financial professionals early in his career, teachers can relate, he embarked on his own self study process to become financially literate. After seeing the benefits of financial literacy in his own life, he was inspired to start the White Coat Investor, the most widely read, physician specific personal finance and investing website in the world. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
It is an honor to speak with you. Let's start with some of those run ins with so called financial professionals. This is very common in the K 12 world. What were your experiences?
Well, it's also very common among doctors. Doctors and teachers have something in common. They may not realize this, but they do, in that people go into the field because they wanted to do it from the time they were in eighth grade. You know, it's not so much a financial motivation. They all expect to be paid, don't get me wrong, but they're doing it out of, a passion for what they're doing. And because of that, they're maybe not the same people that go into business, they go into insurance, they go into finance, they go into banking. They're not as motivated by money as those folks. They're different people. And because of that, they tend to be a little bit more trusting and sometimes a little too much trusting of those in the financial services space. They assume that similar professional standards apply. In medicine, at the end of medical school, we all get up and recite the Hippocratic Oath, which basically says we're going to have a fiduciary standard with our patients. We are going to do what's right for them, whether or not it's right for us, and or right for our pocketbook, right? And so we assume that every other professional out there operates this way because we call up a GI doc at 3 o'clock in the morning to come in and scope somebody who's Ralph and blood all over the place. Looks like a scene from The Exorcist. The patient's uninsured. They're not going to get paid for it. And you know what? They get up out of bed, they come in and they take care of the patient. And it's similar with teaching. And the downside is, the financial services industry kind of takes advantage of that. In a way, it's probably worse for doctors than teachers in that they are viewed as whales,
Mm.
to be harpooned like something out of Moby Dick, and they want to land you early in your career before you start making all this money and have all this money, and they want to get a portion of it. And so doctors find themselves very much targeted by the financial services industry, and I was no different. So I basically got hosed by just about every type of financial professional there is out there. I got sold a whole life insurance policy as a medical student. I didn't even have an income, right? And the worst part is they didn't sell me the insurance I needed, which was a big fat term life insurance policy. So that was a bad run in, right? I had a realtor that talked me into buying a house when we shouldn't have been buying a house. I had a mortgage lender twice try to hose us on, a mortgage refinance, basically trying to slip in prepayment penalties. I had a recruiter that, was not entirely truthful with me. I had a financial advisor that I mistook a fee-based advisor for a fee-only advisor. Not the same thing. For those who don't know, fee-based means they charge commissions and fees. And so after a while, when I realized every run-in I had had with a financial professional had ended badly, I figured I better start learning this stuff on my own. And I kind of embarked on a self-study program. I was in residency at the time, so I was busy, but I lived across the street from a used bookstore. So I'd go over there and buy financial books for $2 or $3. And I read them all. And I read a lot of terrible financial books. There are a lot of awful, awful books out there. But you know what? I started finding the gems as well and gradually became educated and then started looking around and realized nobody's teaching this to doctors. So after helping on forums, the Student Doctor Network and CERMO, which is a doctor-specific forum, and the Bogleheads forum for a number of years, I realized I was doing far more teaching than learning. Got sick of typing the same thing into the internet over and over again and started a blog so that I could just post links to the blog and answer questions. And that was 2011. That was the origin of the White Coat Investor. And for some reason, I got really excited about passive income at the time. So I founded it as a business. It's a for-profit business. It's not a nonprofit like 403(b)(wise). We have ads all over it and we have products that we sell and stuff. It turned out the income wasn't passive at all, but That's what got me excited about it, was the passive income and just the ability to quit typing the same thing over and over again into the internet. But since then, it's grown and become a podcast and a video cast and online courses and an in-person conference and 4 books and online communities. And it's really been pretty wild to watch it grow, not only, as an influence in the space, but as a business. I now have 15 people whose families were supporting with this stupid thing I started by typing crap into the internet, which is pretty wild. I look around at it and I'm like, boy, this sure feels like easy come, easy go. And they look at it like a real job. They've got benefits and everything, so it's kind of weird that way.
Well, speaking of the benefits you offer, I listened to your podcast when you talked about starting a retirement plan for your employees, and it was remarkably similar to what Scott and how we went about starting our plan for 403BYs for our 1.5 employees. Scott, do you want to describe how you approach that? Because we wish every employer in the country, not just medical employers or educational employers, but we wish they would have the same approach. Do you want to just briefly say what your attitude was towards creating a plan?
Sure. Well, I don't know if we have the best 401k in the country, but I don't know of a better one. So, and that was the goal. For a number of years, everybody who worked here, other than my wife and I, were contractors. So everybody had their own individual 401k. They had solo 401k. So everyone could get whatever they wanted. They'd go to Vanguard or Fidelity or Schwab or whatever and just open a solo 401k. And everybody was pretty happy with that. But it got to the point where it didn't make sense for people to be independent contractors. They were really employees, and we needed to call them employees and treat them like employees. And so we made a transition, and they were all bummed, right? Because they're losing their individual 401ks. They've got these great plans that they've picked up themselves, and they love being able to max them out and put all kinds of money in. And a number of our employees are married to docs or married to another high earner. They were maxing these things out. I mean, they were putting $60,000 a year into these retirement plans. They did not want to be limited to just $20,000, an employee contribution into these plans. This was a big deal for the company. And so we sat down and talked to what people wanted to do, how much they wanted to save, and talked to the employees and saw what they wanted. And part of it is that we do, we're in the space. We teach people about saving for retirement and retirement accounts and investing and that stuff. So our employees are not, rookies to these subjects. They want to save for retirement. They want to have low fees. They want to have good investments. They want index funds in their plans. And so we talked to them about what they wanted, how much they wanted to save, and tried to put together a plan that met everybody's goals. And the truth is, it's not that hard to offer all the options in a 401k. You can have a great 401k. It doesn't cost any more than having a crappy one. You can put good investments in there. So the only investments in there are super low cost index funds. That's it. Now there's a brokerage window. If they want to go buy something else, they can. Right? And if it's sold at Fidelity, they can buy it. I've even got a couple of private real estate funds in there. It's fine, right? You can do that with our plan. So it's nice to have that option. But the default options, right? Low cost index funds. And we figured, why not allow them to make regular contributions, tax deferred, Roth contributions? Why not put in after tax contributions and let them do an in-plan conversion? Right? So we put all these options in there. We even have the loan option in there. I don't think anybody's ever taken a loan from it, but they could if they needed to. So if you could put the option in the plan, we put it in there. We learned a lot of things about plans, though, and all the testing, the non-discriminatory testing that's required for plans. And it was very interesting because, we talked to these guys putting the plan in place, and they're like, well, you got to do the testing. You're going to end up having to pay penalties. And I'm like, well, what's the penalty? Well, the penalty is putting a few $1,000s into your employee's retirement account. That's the penalty. You don't pay anything to the IRS, right? You don't have to go to jail. You get to help your employees save for retirement. That's your penalty. And I'm like, well, I'm okay with that. So we pay penalties every year because we want, the highly compensated employees, the owners, we want to max these things out. And so that costs us a few $1,000s every year in penalties. And when people come on, we tell them, you know what, you're going to get a bunch of money. I can't tell you exactly what your match is going to be. Technically, it's a penalty, but you're going to get a few $1,000s every year from us. And they do. And so we try to give everybody what they want in the 401k, and we're small enough still so far that we can do that. Now, if you're in a school district with 2,500 employees, maybe you can't do that sort of a thing that we can do with 15. But the point is, why have a crummy plan if you don't have to? You know, you might as well have a good one.
Oh, spoken so well, Scott. I have one more question before I turn it over to Scott. What is the ratio of time you spend as a physician to the time you spend running the White Coat Investor?
Well, let's go back a few years. All right. I hired my first employee in 2014. And even for a few years after that, I would say through about 2016, I had two 100%, one full-time equivalent jobs. I was working two jobs full time. I was doing the White Coat Investor and I was doing medicine. And starting in 2016, I was like, I can't do this anymore. Number one. Number two, I don't need to do this anymore. You know, the White Coat Investor is actually making money now. And I started cutting back. I started hiring more people at the White Coat Investor and I started cutting back on shifts. I went to 3/4 time, a couple of years later to half time. I'm now at 0.4 FTEs in medicine. So how does that work out in emergency medicine? Well, a full-time emergency doctor works about 15 shifts a month. You know, whether they take vacation, whether there's holidays, it works out to 15 a month. So that's full-time. So 0.4 FTEs, 6 shifts a month. So about a shift and a half a week on average. Now I tend to travel quite a bit. So when I'm working, it actually ends up being more than that. But that's what I'm doing in emergency medicine. And as I've hired people to help run the business, I'd say I'm probably about the same place with the White Coat Investor. So I'm probably working about 0.8 FTEs total now, which is good because we're pretending we're retired. We go on a lot of trips, a lot of traveling, a lot of adventuring, try to spend time with our kids. I'm playing on two hockey teams. You know, we're in the post-fire stage of life. We've been financially independent now for, depends on how you know, judge it, but 4, 5, 6 years, something like that. And so we figure if we're going to work, we're only going to do work we enjoy when we want to do it, and enjoy the rest of our lives. But work's still an important part of our lives for both of us, and I think I found the combination that works pretty well for me, and it's not full time.
God, I feel like the doctor and I have so much in common. We're both doctors, right? I play hockey poorly. I have a feeling you play it well, and I love your approach to balancing still being a doctor with running the website. I still teach part time at a college, and I love that combination. Um, I actually would ask you one more question. Do you ever talk finances with your patients?
Every now and then, I mostly am teaching them how to interact with our stupid medical system. We have a
Oh
terrible
yeah.
medical system in this
Yeah.
country. I mean, if you think there's problems in education, you have no idea what healthcare is dealing with. And
Yeah.
anybody who thinks it's a simple problem to fix doesn't understand the problem. You know, if someone just throws out a simple solution, Medicare for all, right? They don't understand the problem. It's super complex. There's a lot of moving parts in it. It's not easy to fix, and the patients get caught in it.
Yeah.
You know, for example, hospitals have what are called charge master prices. And these are these ridiculous prices that are
Yeah.
set way too high just to ensure that we get every dollar we can from the insurance companies. But, you know, we might contract with an insurance company for $1,000 for a procedure and the charge master price on it might be 4,000. And the problem is uninsured patients, what do they see on their bill? They see 4,000, which is insane, right? And so I help people deal with that. A lot of people don't realize there really shouldn't be anybody uninsured in the country anymore, you know,
Yeah.
due to Obamacare. I'm like, do you have any idea how cheap this would be for you to sign up for Obamacare? You know, and it's funny the way it works. It comes back as the subsidy comes back as a tax refund. And so they don't get it for a while. They don't see that it's really cheap for them because of the way it happens and the complexity that was introduced to the system. But you know, between Medicaid and CHIP and, you know, Medicare and Obamacare, you know, there's very little reason for anybody to be uninsured anymore. And so I help a lot of patients figure that out. So the next time they come in, they don't get hit with a big, huge bill. But not, I don't sit there and teach them about index funds or anything. You know who I do talk about that is I'll transfer a patient to another hospital or something, you know, send them to the big ivory tower hospital, and the doc will recognize my name that I'm transferring the patient to, and I'll do a little
Uh,
financial consult on the phone with them. That happens fairly frequently.
I keep saying last question, but could you encapsulate briefly how you might try to address our healthcare system?
Well, there's a few things that have to be done. One is you have to let markets solve what markets can solve, and the markets can help with a lot of things in our healthcare system, but we don't have a functioning market in healthcare. And there's two reasons why. Number one is there's no transparency of prices. You have no idea what the cost is. How are you going to choose? You might very well choose the cheaper option if you could see what the prices are. And say, oh, well, I just want the $500 version. I don't want the $1,500 version. But there's no transparency whatsoever, particularly when you come into the emergency department and get admitted to the hospital. You just have no idea what the price is going to be. We don't have any idea what the price is going to be. And so everybody making decisions, the patients and the doctor, are making decisions without any regard to the economic ramifications whatsoever. So that's a problem. We need to actually know what things cost. And issue number two is there's far too many people with no skin in the game. Whether you're on, a Medicare, or you're on a regular insurance and you've already hit your deductible, or you're on Medicaid, or you're on TRICARE or whatever, you have no skin in the game, right? You don't care if it costs $500 or $1,500. You're like, I want the best. I'm not paying for any of it. And so there's got to be some skin in the game. There's got to be some transparency of pricing. And we got to recognize that there's some things that a market cannot solve in healthcare. And we've got to step in publicly and take care of those things. Just like we don't expect people to fork out a check to the fire department when they show up and your house is on fire. There are a number of things in our emergency care system that should be a public good. And, things like that. And so it's not an easy problem to solve. And I don't know that I could solve it, but I often imagine a third career where I work on this problem. It's just such a big problem that physician financial literacy just seems so much easier to solve.
Wow, Scott, I'm on board to this idea. I guess you need to think of a catchy name for it, but it sounds so reasonable, which I know ties into, your approach to managing money. And Scott's going to answer questions or ask you questions like that. But thank you for sharing your thoughts. I really like what you had to say.
Dan, it really reminds me of when we had Carolyn McClanahan on. Jim, you're probably familiar with Carolyn.
She's I know Carolyn.
Yep. Yeah, she's great. And she has some very similar, I guess, she says very similar things. And Dan and I have experienced the healthcare system, and we are, very privileged, and it still can just be a complete and absolute nightmare, even though we love our doctors and our nurses and the people that we interact with.
Yeah, it's definitely got its issues, no doubt about it.
It's interesting. So I wrote down what you said some of the problems were in healthcare. One, no transparency. That tracks well with the 403B for educators. There's no transparency in pricing. Two, no skin in the game. Tracks very well with the 403B for educators. The employers, they don't pay for this cost, and they don't even make employer contributions for the most part. And then finally, some things the market cannot solve. There are aspects of the 403B that I think the free market is not solving right now. Very different issue than what we're talking about with you today, though. I'm interested, though, do you need to provide much education at all to your participants in your 401k plan, given they work for a personal finance site or company?
It's interesting because I get these questions from employees, and I'm like, I've been writing about this for 10 years. You've been working here for 7. You don't know the answer to this? I give them a hard time. But so we have to do a few things. And of course, we have new people coming on board all the time. So we do have to do some education. I hope it's less than most companies, though. But what's interesting, though, is just the desire to learn it, the desire to, max out those benefits, whatever they might be. And, I think everybody wants to get as much as they can out of the work they're doing. So I don't know that's necessarily unusual among other people, but people tend to do what those around them are doing. And at our company, people are taking advantage of this benefit. In fact, we even talked about adding on a cash balance plan to the 401k. But people were just like, we can't save that much money, and but they're, into it and they're interested in it. And I think if we could kind of inculcate that culture among teachers and other 403B users, that they're interested in it, that this is important, that then I think that would go a long way toward eliminating these bad plans that you see out there, because the pressure would be there on the administrators.
Let's stay on this topic. It's slightly out of the order of the questions that I had put together, but K-12 403B is generally terrible. They often have multiple vendors. The costs are very high. They're undisclosed. Very little transparency, and there's so many people who oftentimes don't put the participants' interest first. But the 403B is widely available to medical professionals as well. There are a lot of not-for-profit hospitals and some state and local governments. They would be more 457. What's your assessment of the quality of 403B plans that are available to medical professionals yourself? I guess do you work in a private or public?
I do not have a 403B available to me. I've got a couple of 401ks. The one with my partnership, it's a private practice, and then the one with White Coat Investor, of course. But I think the doctor 403Bs are better, to be honest with you, than the ones I see in education. The best part about it is that it's often paired with other plans. Like they may have a 403B and a 401A and a 457B, if they're a university doctor.
Yeah.
And so between all of them, they may be able to get $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, whatever into their plans. And so that tends to put them on par with what the private practice doctors are getting in one plan. They may just have a 401k profit sharing plan, plus minus a defined benefit plan. But, this is one of the hard things about being a doc, right? Is sorting through all of the retirement plans you have available to you. And you got to do your Roth IRA contributions via the back door, So a lot of what I do at the White Coat Investor is helping people with retirement accounts, whereas I think the typical American has one. And it's just really straightforward. Well, I'm going to save $15,000 this year. And that all fits in my 401k. Great. And so they don't have to do this juggling of different retirement accounts that I see among doctors. But as a general rule, I do think they're better in healthcare systems than they are in education systems.
What might account for this difference?
I don't know. It may be cultural. It may be just inertia. It may also be that doctors pay more attention than teachers. I don't know.
Do you think ERISA, the fact that 403Bs for teachers are not covered by ERISA, whereas for the most part for medical professionals, they are covered by ERISA?
That's interesting. I was not aware of that, but that could have an influence on it. I suspect a lot of it may just be ignorance. People don't know. Administrators that are selecting the plans don't know. They're not financially literate. The participants aren't financially literate. And so who comes in? Well, some unscrupulous financial advisor that starts thinking, wow, if I can get a 2% AUM fee off, the 2,500 teachers in this school district, this is a great opportunity for me. And they come in and, it's hard to convince somebody that what they're doing is maybe not right when their salary depends on them continuing to do it.
I think we know that the history of that quote. What would you say the biggest financial challenge for doctors, or what would you say the biggest financial challenges that doctors face that you encounter?
It's embarrassing to say this, right? Because your audience is mostly not doctors. And they look at doctors who make $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year and say, if I had making $200,000 a year, all my financial problems would be gone. But the truth of the matter is, doctors are just like everybody else. Whether you make $40,000 or $60,000 or $250,000, the most likely thing you're going to do is spend the whole thing. Some of it's going to go toward your student loans, and some of it's going to go to taxes. And if you're a doctor, you're going to pay more in taxes than a typical teacher will. It's not even close. And then you're going to spend the rest. And that's the normal thing to do. And doctors do that just like everybody else does. So the biggest problem for doctors is they don't save. And they actually have to save more than the average American. The figure for most people is probably 15%. If you save 15% of your gross for retirement throughout your career, you're going to have that same standard of living in retirement that you had throughout your working career. For doctors, that doesn't work. You got to save 20% because you're not even starting to earn until you're in your 30s. And then you owe $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 in student loans. And Social Security is going to make up a much smaller percentage of your retirement income than it is for somebody else. You know, it's not as good of a deal for a high earner as it is for a low earner. And so when you add all that in, doctors need to save 20%. And there's plenty of doctors out there that are saving 2% or 0%. And it's really crazy to look at the statistics. If you do net worth surveys of doctors and you ask doctors in their 60s what their net worth is, you will find that 11 to 12% have a net worth under $500,000. And this is after 30 years of making $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year. And about a quarter of doctors have less than $1 million. They're not millionaires in retirement because they didn't save. Now, did other things happen? Were they the victim of a scam? Sometimes. Did they get divorced twice? Sometimes. But for the most part, the problem is they didn't save. And so that's definitely the biggest problem.
I think you just answered my next question, which I'll say. What's funny about you, Jim, is you just keep anticipating our questions. And so we have to keep marking them off. I'm like, okay, that's done. That's done. That's done. So we're going to start thinking of some stuff off the top of our head, Dan. But the question was, and maybe you can add on to it, or maybe you've already answered, but what would you tell any physician or medical professional or someone who's entering the field right now? What would you tell them to know about saving for retirement? It seems like save for retirement, but yeah. What else?
Well, doctors have a big advantage over most people, right? They have this high income. And you got to take advantage of that because you do have some disadvantages. You're starting late. You're having a whole bunch of debt. You've got these complex retirement accounts to deal with. You got this target on your back, but you've got a really big shovel. You know, you can save a lot of money. You can make a lot of money. You can save a lot of money. And so I tell doctors to take advantage of that. And what I tell them is I tell them to live like a resident for a few years after they finish their training. And so if they will do that for 2 or 3 years, and all I'm asking them to do is to live like your typical listener. You know, if they will live like they're making $50,000 or $60,000 for 2 or 3 years while they're earning $250,000 or $300,000 or $400,000, well, they've just set themselves up for life financially. They've paid off their student loans. They've saved up a down payment for their dream home. They've caught up to their college roommates in retirement savings. And basically, they have put the habits in place that will allow them to be financially free by mid-career. And that's pretty awesome. And you wouldn't believe how hard doctors push back against that idea, because they have been deferring gratification for more than a decade now. They want to enjoy the money they're making. And then 6 months after their attendings, they realize, well, their student loan payments are kicking in. They've got 2 payments on Teslas and they've got a big fat mortgage payment. And all of a sudden they can't save any money.
Well, I guess it must be difficult also, like looking around, seeing other doctors, maybe doctors that have another 10, 15, 20 years of experience and seeing their maybe a bigger house, nicer car, taking great vacations. And they're like, I deserve this as well. I'm not going to save this money, but they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot, I guess.
Yeah. And part of it is a societal expectation.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you think about what you think about when you talk to a doctor. This guy must be rich. This lady must be really wealthy, right? They're not. Doctors are not wealthy. You know, the measure of wealth is net worth. And when a doctor is 32 and comes out of residency, their net worth is probably minus $400,000. They are the poorest people on the planet. That guy living on the aqueduct, under the aqueduct, his net worth 0, right? Maybe a little more because there's a bunch of stuff in the shopping cart. The doctor's minus 400,000. Now, Crimea River, right? They've also got a $250,000 income. So they've got the means to change that for sure. But they have to actually do a few things to do that. It's not an automatic process.
It's I don't think most people have that perspective. So very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And I've actually, in the doctors that I've worked with in my practice and that talk to me when I'm, meeting with them, and, even, eye doctors and dentists and things like that, I hear the exact same thing because they have, all these years of medical school, their student loans are just massive. And they don't necessarily have the income at first, especially if they're trying to go into private practice quickly, because that costs money, and then they're running a business as well. That can be very overwhelming,
Yeah.
and I imagine also lead to like a lot of physical and mental health problems, just like
Yeah,
the rest of us.
for
So,
sure.
are you
And
saying,
then
Jim,
there's
that
this
doctors are?
expectation. There's this expectation to spend,
Yeah,
from your family, right? You graduate from medical school, and they're like, "Oh, you're the rich doctor now." Right? You still got 5 years of residency ahead of you. You owe $250,000 in student loans, and your family thinks you're rich. Your patients think you're rich. You're not rich yet.
not yet.
So,
It sounds like you're saying that doctors are people too, Jim.
yeah, it turns out they are.
Man, okay. So you've built this incredible website, this incredible business. I mean, it really is something to behold. I mean, me and Dan are looking at it. We've been doing this a long time, but in very different capacities. But there's so much to admire here, and I think we think you're making such a big difference in the lives of these doctors, and hopefully, the young ones who are coming out are getting this message. My question to you is there a white coat investor type platform for nurses and other healthcare workers, or have you thought of creating something for them as well? Who do they look to for this sort of, I mean, really great advice?
Well, let's be honest about how personal finance works, right? 95% of this is exactly the same for all of us. It's the same for a teacher as it is for a doctor. There's about 4% that's specific to high earners, whether it's retirement account stuff, tax stuff, asset protection stuff, whatever. And then there's maybe 1% that's specific to doctors. So while the focus is definitely on doctors, and perhaps 3/4 of our audience is physicians and dentists, there's plenty of other people that are part of the white coat investor community, whether they're tech workers or engineers or attorneys or small business owners or whatever. And so we do try to reach podiatrists and optometrists and nurses and nurse practitioners and PAs and that sort of thing. We know that the more different their financial lives are from doctors, the less specific the information is for them. And I've seen a few people try to do this for pharmacists and try to do it for veterinarians and try to do it for dentists even. But the truth is, the more you niche down, the smaller pond you're fishing in, and the less likely you are to have a viable business. And even the white coat investor, right? This wasn't making enough money to be worth my time for about 4 years. And most people don't have the passion to carry something through for 4 years when it's not paying them enough to be worth their time. And so, no, there's not a lot of other resources out there. I've seen one for attorneys that stuck around long enough that I think it's doing something similar. But I wouldn't say there's anything out there for nurses, which is too bad because I sit down with the nurses in the emergency department every few months and help them with their 401ks and stuff. And there's a real need there too.
Absolutely. Well, I can attest from reading through your blog, listening to some of your podcasts. I mean, just an enormous amount of the information that you share, like you said, it's personal finance, and our listeners are not going to be disappointed. They're going to learn something by going to your website and reading the different articles. It's great. One more sort of fun question here. Dan and I are big fans of Bill Bernstein. We've spoken at conferences with him, and he's been on our podcast. Great guy. I know he spoke at one of your conferences. You got any interesting Bill Bernstein stories?
So Bill Bernstein and I go way back. We've known each other for a long time. I probably met Bill in 2008 in person. He obviously wrote the foreword for my first book in 2014, and he's spoken at our conference several times, and we exchange emails from time to time. So I know Bill pretty well. I can predict pretty well how he's going to answer most questions and that sort of a thing. Love his books. We share a love of financial history. And history is so important to understanding finance. There are so many people who are surprised by things that happen. They're surprised when something like Bitcoin pops up. And those of us who know financial history, well, we've seen this movie before. We know how it ends, and other things, market downturns. If you don't realize that you should expect a market downturn every 3 or 4 years, you're likely to panic sell instead of having the mindset that you ought to really be expecting one of these 20 times during your investing career. Funny stories about Bill Bernstein. Well, what you see is what you get with Bill. He's not different in person or behind the scenes than he is in his books than he is when he's talking at a conference. That's Bill, and he's not going to gussy up his slides and make the prettiest slides you've ever seen. He's not going to do that. He's going to put one slide up there and talk for 45 minutes about it, so, he's not always our highest rated speaker at a conference, but those who've been around for a long time really appreciate him because they recognize his contribution, which is basically somebody coming from another field. He was a neurologist, for those who aren't aware, coming from another field and stepping into finance and saying, we really ought to apply all these lessons we're learning in science and in history to finance. And I think that's the biggest contribution he made was to bring all that together and apply it to finance.
Jim, we cannot thank you enough for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Well, I just think there ought to be an appreciation out there for people. If you are listening to this, you probably have a 403B. And what that means is you're working in healthcare, you're working in education, you're a college professor, whatever, by virtue of having access to a 403B, you're a different kind of person. And so thank you for what you're doing. I think people need to hear that, and they need to hear it more often, because the people that go into these sorts of fields, they're doing it a lot for the thank you and for the appreciation of the students and the patients and whoever. So I think that's important. And two, here's the other thing I want to tell you. There's a taboo in your field about talking about finance. You're not supposed to do it. It's bad, right? It's filthy money. Well, tell you what, nobody else has this taboo in their lives. You're the only one. So get rid of it. It's hurting you. And you will be a better teacher. You will be a better nurse. You'll be a better whatever if you are more financially secure, because you can focus on those you're serving rather than, how you're going to make the payment at the end of the month.
So well said. Jim, thank you for your time. Thank you for what you've built and the contributions you have made to financial literacy. We can't thank you enough.
Thank you for your kind words. It's been a pleasure being here.